Those of you who are going to be staying on through not only today but to tomorrow have the opportunity at the very end of the session to hear Diane wrap everything up with a nice bow. The last 15, 20 minutes of our community of practice will be opportunities to bring ideas together and really think about all right, what's the one thing that God is laying on my heart? And so I hope as you go through these different presentations, you'll be doing a little bit of journaling, writing down what is God trying to speak to me about and how might he be using what I'm hearing, where he's goading me, where he's encouraging me, comforting me. I told my students who are here that they need to be thinking about what's these great, I heard, what did you call it, Margie? Brain candy. These great brain candies that you've just gotten. We can lose them really quickly in the intensity of life and the onslaught of information that we have. So jot those notes down. Keep track of them because in a few months you might want to look at them again to be reminded. These are the little signposts that God gives you. And you don't want to miss them. This is why we go back and read Genesis again and again. Okay, so it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you this morning, Dr. Diane Langberg. Most of you who have been here before know Diane Langberg as a therapist, psychologist, and a lover of the world, a lover of God's creation in the world. And today she's going to come and speak to you about the voice of the refugee. We know a lot about refugees from the stories that we read in the news, or some of you are able to know from the stories that you have heard face to face. Oftentimes those stories, though, become less than three-dimensional. They become sound bites and clips. So as Diane remind you of the experience of the refugee. There will be a few slides going up, and those are designed to make what she's saying be multidimensional. Photographs that come up are not so much designed to have you focus in on that slide per se, that photograph per se, except for as an abstract piece of art to get you thinking about that full experience of being a refugee. We're going to do a little bit of popcorn here. She's going to speak for a little bit, and then we're going to do some interactive work based on what she has said. And then she'll come back and speak again, and we'll do a little bit more interactive work around our tables and as a large group. And then she will conclude. If you haven't gotten it already, I highly suggest that you go out and buy her Suffering in the Heart of God book. It was published last year, I believe, by New Growth Press. Suffering in the Heart of God is a compendium, in a sense, of many of her talks that she has given over the years and pulls them together in a useful source that you could use in classes and teaching if you're planning on doing that. Okay? Diane, please come.
You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find returning in the evening hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair, without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home and in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. and may your children turn their faces from you. These words are from This Is a Man, which is both a poem and a book by Primo Levi. He was a brilliant Italian chemist and a survivor of Auschwitz. He was a victim of forced migration in a cattle car. He lived and worked in a camp, a concentration camp. And there are, without question, differences between Primo Levi and the refugees of today, but perhaps not so many as we might think. Today, what I would like to do with you is to attempt, admittedly from afar, to immerse us in what it means to be a refugee, to somehow imagine together what it would be like to leave behind all that is familiar and enter into what I would call permanent strangeness. I want us to think about it circumstantially, relationally, emotionally, spiritually, and of course, given the source, psychologically, particularly from a standpoint of trauma. So let's imagine this together. You were born in a geographically beautiful part of your country. Your family has lived on that land for generations. Your father owns a great deal of the land, and it is farmed, and it is very productive, as it was for his father and his grandfather, and even further back. You take pride in the land and in your family history there. Your father is also a businessman and quite wealthy. Your home is lovely and large. You have 3 siblings, and education is very important. You go to school and you study hard, both at school and at your place of worship. You ride horses across the land to watch the sunset. Your family is held in high esteem and has been so for generations. And then war comes, civil war. Ancient tribes refuse to continue under the same government. Your eldest brother leaves to fight and never comes back. Your father's brow is always furrowed. He does not travel for business anymore. You are not allowed to ride across the land. What has been always safe is now always dangerous. Eventually, you find supplies shrinking and have only what is grown on the farm. There are no more horses to ride. They have been eaten. Heating oil is exorbitant. Electricity is intermittent. The soldiers come close, and you are no longer allowed to go to school, for they roam the roads you must travel, carrying very big guns. One day, some of the workers on the farm join with the resistance and turn on your family, a family that has always been kind to them. They rape your mother and your sisters, and they kill your father while you are all forced to watch. Your mother now sits and stares and sometimes screams in the night. She tells you and your sisters that you must all flee or be killed. And so you pack up a few things and put them in your backpack. You hide away money and some jewels in hopes that they will help provide you with necessities. All else must be left behind. You leave in the early dawn, locking up the house, though you're not sure why, and join with some other neighbors who are fleeing. Your sisters are 4 and 10. You are 16. And your mother tells you that you are now the man of this family. You kneel down and you kiss the land goodbye. You do not yet know that you will never again wrap yourself in the familiarity of home. you are afraid. When I think of the literally millions of stories like this, many I have read, some I have heard firsthand, I, of course, think of the trauma. And trying to grasp the wide range of the trauma of refugees today, it occurred to me that we might define refugee trauma as the trauma of the loss of all things. It is indeed a state of permanent strangeness. Now, you know, of course, that trauma of any kind is overwhelming by its very nature, and not just for the victim, but for the ones who bear witness. But you take the story above and put your life in its place, your home, its meaning to you, your family, your prosperity, the beauty of the land that you live in, your favorite nooks and crannies in your world, your traditions, your family history, and whatever pieces of that you might own, the basic predictability of your days, your expectation of enough food or heat or shelter and safety in your space. And now superimpose on those images of your home the facts of what I have just related. Safety ripped away, predictability destroyed, family members raped and killed before your eyes, the basics of life gone, and then, in order to live, you must leave behind all of that for permanent strangeness. What will you put in your backpack? What pieces of your life will you consider necessary when you do not even know the place to which you are going? Think about the losses with me. Loss of country, citizenship as a benefit, because if it matters elsewhere at all, it will more than likely be a deficit. Loss of land, home, roots, way of life, access to education, your community, your place of worship, your routine, your belongings, familiarity, your language, safety, predictability, family as you have always known it, brother and father gone, mother and sisters gone in a different way. Laughter, traditions and celebrations, security, relationships. As one refugee said, home is valuable. Home is precious. The smell of home matters a lot. You've lost the smell of home, of your bed. Another said, I miss my home, my kitchen, and my street. And another, I am alive, but I have lost my life. So many of these losses are ones that inform our sense of identity. Your sense of self is shattered because it is always understood in context. If someone comes to you here and asks you who you are, it will be in context that you describe yourself. I am from this country. This is the work that I do. I live in this local region. I am male or female, whatever. I am from blank. My home is blank. My work is blank. As a refugee, what have you acquired? Well, you've inherited grief and loss, insecurity, changed identity, demeaning labels, high risk of being swindled, raped, trafficked, or killed, disconnection from family and community, tremendous unknowns, danger, scorn, rejection, fear, fading precious memories, a language you cannot comprehend, overwhelming trauma memories, phenomenal vulnerability, a truncated family, or as one refugee stated, after a while, You stop missing anyone or anything. You're breathing. The days, they continue. But that's it. I don't have hope anymore. The truth is, when you have hope, you hurt. We heard from Josh yesterday about these sufferers. 60 million or so souls. If it were a country, it would number the 23rd largest in the world. In 2014, 42,000 people were daily displaced. 42,000. Half of the refugees today are children. They are the most malleable and vulnerable beings on the face of this earth. Over 23,000 lone children sought asylum in Europe in 2014. And hidden, of course, within the global refugee crisis are many others. Things like the hidden violence of women and children. Families desperate for money to feed the rest of their family sell one of their daughters. Domestic violence inflicted by husbands and brothers and uncles has greatly increased, but it is a taboo subject, and so it continues in silence. And many of these children suffer what we call in my field psychological maltreatment. Listen to its definition. The first one is one we are all familiar with, a repeated pattern of caregiver behavior, like physical or child sexual abuse. But here is the second definition: a serious incident that transmits to the child that he or she is worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, and endangered, or only of value in meeting another's needs. Psychological maltreatment involves spurning, terrorizing, exploiting, rejecting. This type of abuse results in great harm to the child. The disruptions of their psychological safety, the impediments to normal development, and the development of essential human capacities like emotion regulation, self-acceptance, esteem, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. Children and youth who experience such treatment exhibit elevated levels of aggression, noncompliance, conduct problems, and delinquency. And one of the frightening outcomes you see of the refugee crisis is that it is shaping the next generations and is potentially affecting the stability of the entire world. This crisis is not just present tense, though it certainly is. It is also a future crisis being created before our very eyes. Most of the world is aware of Syrian, Afghan, and Iraqi refugees. The US is keenly aware of those from Central and South America. And we can, of course, add Somalians who survive in Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, as well as Sudanese, the Karen fleeing Burma, and many others. It is obviously a crisis for the refugees themselves, but it is also a crisis for the countries they flee, and the countries they pass through, and the countries where they will settle. And where do they live? Well, for the most part, in camps, with tents, or storage containers, or other frail things for dwellings, often sitting in mud, with little access to necessities, let alone amenities. Some rent places in countries. Many of those households are run by women with little to no income, and they eventually end up on the street. And do keep in mind that many of these people are gifted, educated, formerly prosperous, with no avenues for supporting their families or themselves. Who knows what percentage of them, adults and children alike, are traumatized, sleeping in frail structures in the mud with horrific nightmares and memories and without hope. I want to read you a poem. It's a brutal poem. It was written by a woman named Warsan Shire, and she's a Kenyan-born Somali. The words are very raw and disturbing, but she eloquently describes the experience of being a refugee leaving home. And her words speak truth, and I believe we not only need to hear this today, but I would invite you, as much as you are able, to with me companion with her through the experiences that she describes. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home will not let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under your feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. And even then, you carried the anthem under your breath. Only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear you would never go back. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains and beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten or pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison, because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one could take it. No one could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go-home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry, niggers with their hands out, they smell strange, savages, messed up their country, and now they want to mess ours up. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your back? Maybe because the blow is softer than having a limb torn off. Or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs. Or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble or bone, or than having your child body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg, forget pride, because your survival is more important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. I want to go home now, but home is the mouth of a shark. And grievously, the journey to a hoped-for, safe, though strange place is often anything but safe, and the arrival point is often not much better. It is certainly nothing of home. It is an overwhelming thought to consider, because a safe place only exists in permanent strangeness. It would seem an oxymoron.
Let's let those words settle in. Thinking about this information, we hear words, they wash over us like waves and ideas, and yet they pass on, and it's easy to let them go. We need to sit with them a little bit longer, and so we need to do it by voicing them ourselves. One of the geniuses of the Healing Wounds of Trauma material is that it's for adult learners and also child learners, but adult learners here. Adult learners need to talk. They need to share. If you've ever studied for a test, you have to say things out loud in order to really own them. So, if you'll remember, chapter 2 in the manual, the Healing Wounds of Trauma manual, talks about a family. Each story is different in your context, but there's a family that has lost something. There is a heart wound and a physical wound, and we compare those two things. But one of the first questions we ask is, what has this family lost? In the, I think the most recent American version, US version, is, what has Peter lost? He has lost a leg. But we want to go well beyond that. And so I want you to think about refugees. What have these refugees lost? And just to help guide you, you heard some of the things that Diane talked about: loss of country, identity, land, capacity, agency. They also gain things, by the way, gain things that they don't want to gain, which is illness, sickness, and being labeled. You heard some of those horrific labels. Around your tables, I want you to take a few minutes here and just say them to each other. What are some of the things refugees have lost relating to these categories: emotional, material, biological, social, cultural, geographical, spiritual? These are all pieces of well-being. So share them. Maybe some of these will be ones that you have personally lost, or stories that you have heard face-to-face, or stories you have imagined. But share them, because as we share them, they mount up in us, and we can feel that overwhelming need, and also the overwhelming hopelessness. So share amongst yourselves. Because we're a large group, we'll probably only get one or two of you to share out loud, but I'm going to give you 3 minutes, so talk quickly. Okay, let me have your attention. And those tables that are closest to the mic, sorry, we're going to be a little discriminatory here, just to speed up time. Could I get somebody to share? We can be really fast popcorn here. On this side, an emotional, material, and biological loss. Just an example. Somebody from one of these tables, hop up and give us some of the things that were said at your table. Peace, joy, hope, security, dignity, a point of reference. Good. I'm going to repeat because we want this all on the recording. Okay, give me a biological. Smell. Somebody said smell. This is a really important one that we might not think about this. Things that are really comforting to us. How about spiritual? Faith. That's right. Lots of things here. Culture. What's lost in culture often? Traditions. That's exactly right. Now, keep language. That's right, language. Food. That's right, comfort food, right? Now, keep all those things in mind. Here's the question that I want you to really consider. That was all just the preliminary one to get us going. And I'm going to actually split the room in half. Half of you are going to work on the first question. That's this side of the room. The other half are going to work on the second question. Again, we're going to be efficient with our time on this. But here's the thing. If you have lost all those things and you are a refugee, what kinds of responses might you expect from a refugee as yourself, especially when they're in a long-term displacement and they're being kept alive by a system that keeps them in that long-term displacement? You know, we heard from Joshua and thinking about Palestinian refugees, 68 years. That's a few generations there of people. A permanent. We are kept alive and we are kept in limbo. We have lots of those kinds of camps around. So what kinds of responses might you expect from people? This is your question. Your side, we're going to think about what kind of reactions might you have as helpers to such people who might not necessarily be responding the way you most would like them to respond to your wonderful and glorious help. Okay? Talk amongst yourselves. And elect a couple people when you're doing this to come up to the microphone and say a couple of your thoughts. Okay, go. Okay, not nearly enough time to talk about this, but would a couple of you on this side jump up to the mic and tell us a couple of things of responses that might in fact take place? What kinds of responses might you expect? Well, there is right here in the middle. Pass it to the next one.
Okay. One response that has been seen is that the refugees will say, I'm going to teach my kids, we're going to remember and we're going to teach our kids why we're in this camp and who it was that was responsible for us being in this camp.
Okay, sure. Next one. Up here, Matthew.
Disengaged, dissociation, lack of hope, and turning inward, numb and paralyzed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Somebody else.
Anger, rage, maybe ungratefulness.
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, also a resiliency and a fighting spirit.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? We have a couple standing up here, so.
Our table read the question a little bit differently. What would we as caregivers expect from the refugees? And that's gratitude. They should be happy. We're accepting them. They should learn our language, etc.
Right. Reverend Williams. Yes, thank you. That's it.
Our group said rebellion, cynical, numbness, desperation. Some had expectation, hope to go back home, confusion. We talked about the children. How would they, do we think that they would be more resilient? And some of the kids probably would respond with aggressiveness. Physically, they might feel comforted because they're still with the family.
Right.
But emotionally, they're left to themselves.
Right. Very good. And one more. Thank you.
Resignation, possibly sickness, physical sickness, also mental illness, depression, a numbness, negativity.
Very good. Very good. Now you have to bring it all the way up and put it back in its holder. Okay, excellent. Now, this side, I heard Kelly say this, and she's absolutely right. I asked you guys to answer the question without having the first one answered, but I know you're really capable people. So, quick, come to the mic and then hand it off like we did the other side. What are some of your own reactions as helpers? You guys got a jump on it? That's great.
Angry, fear, you might make it worse, overwhelmed, become apathetic, defense mechanism, hopeless, cynical, judgment, loss of purpose in what you do in your normal life. If you only knew how bad that's what you wouldn't, and that spills over to your children.
Good. Somebody else. Heather, you're coming up. Sounds a lot like the other side, it seems like.
We talked about that aspect of expecting them to be grateful, that's a very dangerous mechanism, and that expressing patience. And I think those of us who do psychotherapy, especially with trauma survivors, it's easier to do with your clients than someone you live with regularly or someone who's living in your home even. There's a sense of like invasion of space without gratitude. Teenagers will trigger that. So that's something that just to be aware of, just to be aware of that.
That you'd be drained, that you would begin to find your own ways to self-protect, how to stay safe yourself. We talked about being amazed at their innovation to survive.
That's right. So we can have a whole host of reactions, and they often look a lot like those who we're trying to help, right? And we can end up just as hopeless. So Dr. Langberg will come up now and tell us how to fix it all.
Well, I don't believe that, and I'm sure you don't either, so. However, this great and very sad crisis is certainly a call to the nations and to their governments. But we all know that governments are struggling mightily and frequently rather poorly. And we know that the souls of 60+ million refugees cannot be cared for by governments. Governments have a great responsibility for which they are ill prepared. But we also know and believe that the day will come when the Son of Man will judge the nations. And he will judge them according to such things as hunger and thirst and strangers and nakedness and sickness and imprisonments. He will judge them for naming people dirty immigrants who will only mess up our countries. But we are not government. It is not our sphere. We can, I believe, and should call our governments to be humanitarian in their handling of these matters. But you and I are ultimately not citizens of this world or even of our own countries. We are citizens of heaven, the home of the Most High God, and are called as his children to look like him in this crisis. So what does that mean? Well, in spite of Phil's comment, first a disclaimer, I can't answer the question. It is volatile, extremely complex, and an eternally important matter. It is without question above my pay grade and my IQ. So a solution I cannot give, but what I do think I can do today is remind us of some undergirding foundational truths that should guide any response that we have, whether it is attitudinal or physical, practical, trauma-related, spiritual, educational, or anything else you can think of. I've already stated the first principle. This is an eternally important matter. Why is that so? It is so because no matter where they come from, who they were and are now, what they have done, what their faith is or is not, how they behave, how strange they seem, or any other aspect you can name, every single refugee on the face of this planet is enclosed in this particular truth. Let us, the triune God, make man in our image, according to our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. In a very short space of time, the fact of God's image in us is mentioned 4 times. The psalmist says, "You, God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." No refugee who ever traverses this planet, no matter who they are, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their citizenship, their gender, their history, or their deeds, is exempt from these 2 truths. Not one. That means everything that we plan or do needs to rest solidly on these foundational truths. We cannot interact with any human being on the earth who is not an image bearer. No such human exists. They are all image bearers. So how do you care for someone who was literally knit together by the Lord that you serve? and knit together into his likeness? Well, it would follow, of course, that you treat them with great dignity and respect and care and protection and kindness. It means you never treat two legs like four legs. They are not beasts, no matter how low they have fallen. Beasts are God creatures, but they are not in his image. It means you never treat humans like numbers. Numbers can be helpful, but image bearers are not reducible to numbers, whether they be statistics or dollars. You never treat those in God's image as purely exhibits to raise money for a good cause. I have met refugees who have become nothing but their story of violence, rape, and displacement, because that is all they get to talk about, because that story raises money. Any policy, any program, or effort to help that is not founded on this truth, that every refugee was knit together purposefully by our God and in his image, is not a godly effort. So given that foundation, then, we need to look at humans and what they are like so we can better care for them in this crisis. Now, the most obvious characteristic of humans is they are indeed physical. Every human has a body. No matter what shape it's in, they have one, which means they need food and clothing and shelter and medical care. These are foundational in order for any human to live further out than their body. And there's some fascinating research that talks about that anyone whose identity as human is undermined by radical personal and cultural change, I would say being a refugee qualified for that, is put at special risk for suicide. Because what they have lost is the continuity of the self over time. We as humans need an enduring identity that of the self over time in order to live well and flourish. We need an identity that reaches back into our history, encompasses our present, and leans forward into our future. It is very easy for despairing refugees to forget history. It's often too painful to remember, and to lose sight of any future because they have no hope. You think about that from the standpoint of trauma. The traumatized, as they heal, learn to say, I was, but now I am. Rape, sexual abuse, war, all shatter that continuity. Those who grow up in violent areas like war zones or violent urban communities have little continuity. So I believe that part of enabling humans to live with a continuity of self is found in community through story. That is, in fact, the Old Testament. Even in working with those who have suffered chronic abuse throughout childhood, in working with them and going back and facing what happened, and they claim the part of their story they most want to forget, on the way, in the process, they also see and claim their own courage, their own resilience, their accomplishments in spite of. And they build a new identity that includes the trauma, which it did not before, but is not solely defined by the trauma. Needless to say, this increases significantly if a person is a Christian and God's view of them in his life, giving them work and self and purpose undergirds their story. So if we truly believe that each and every refugee is an image bearer, then that identical is critical to them, to us, and to all of our responses to them. Our responses should be governed by that belief. Affirming and reinforcing that identity is critical. Many years ago, I was in the Dominican Republic, and I was taken out to the edge of a city where the poorest of the poor lived, which is hardly the word for it. And it was muddy and overgrown with weeds, and there literally was no beauty anywhere. I couldn't find it. I looked. There was no hope. They had water piped in on Tuesdays and Fridays. The men had no work and hadn't for years. And as we walked by these fragile huts that they lived in, the men all sat outside with the deadest eyes, staring. They felt like nothing, they did nothing, and they passed nothing on to their children. There was no story. They had lost their story. There was just deadness. And that can easily happen to the refugees today. Given who God says they are, we need to think proactively how to help them not have that happen. Because they are more than a refugee. We need to help them remember who they were and where they came from, and what they loved about it, and what was good about it, and what was strong about it, and how they still carry it in them. We need to help them express and celebrate those things so they can pass those memories on to their children, even if their children were never there. There's been research in recent years that points to significant life outcomes in those children who, though they may live in difficult places, such as poor urban settings, telling them family history and stories and passing on traditions or culture fosters resilience and alters outcome significantly. There is less depression, there is less substance abuse, and there is less suicide. I would remind us as caregivers that being faced with overwhelming trauma overwhelms. If in our responses we simply focus on the loss and the horror and the fear and lose ourselves to the current experiences of the refugees, we will, as we realized in the exercise we just did, end up mirroring them. And those things are real and true and horrific, but they are not the whole of who they are. They are ever and always those created in the image of God, deserving of dignity and care, with strengths and accomplishments and gifts and stories to tell. Let us not forget, so we can help them remember. Humans are, of course, also emotional, they're relational, they're communal. Most of those ties have been severed for refugees. For them to survive or thrive on any level, those ties need to be in some fashion deliberately rewoven. So encouraging them to remember, though it's painful, and form bonds around holidays they used to celebrate or traditions, even in mud-infested camps, restores dignity and passes on to their children a taste of the home that was. Education needs to be fostered. People don't stop thinking or wanting to learn just because they're in a refugee camp. Some camps don't have schools because the camp is temporary, only it isn't. And even if it is, we need to encourage them not to stop teaching their children. Their children need them and the knowledge and the history that they carry. Refugee camps are full of people who are brilliant and gifted. They're full of doctors and lawyers and all kinds of things. One of the things that people lose, of course, and so often is there's no place to work. There's no place to earn money. And the professionals who made good livings feel like they've lost everything, including their own agency and ability to care for their families. And we may not be able to provide them with a job that gives them a paycheck, but there are skills in those camps that would benefit other refugees. Care, which not only cares for others, but builds the esteem in the one who is doing the caring. Humans are meant to work, encouraging, using the gifting in the service of others will nurture dignity and give respect and the individuals involved will become less alienated and disenfranchised, qualities that lead to suicide, self-destruction, rage, and violence, all things that create more refugees. These things also support qualities that prepare refugees to be viable members of a new country and community if they are moved out of the camps into a place that is to become home. Humans have emotions and the capacity for memory. Those are wonderful qualities if you feel love and joy and hope and remember good things. Those capacities can seem like a curse when you experience the loss of all things and have a head full of atrocities born and witnessed. You who work with trauma know what it means. Somebody being stuck around the trauma and just going around and around and around it with overwhelming fear and panic and grief and loss and interrupted sleep and nightmares. For a large number of refugees, there have been multiple traumas. And we know from the research that many traumas often result in chronic PTSD. And as we discussed a few years ago in the COP, when looking at ongoing trauma as opposed to one that is over, it's not always post. It's not post-trauma for these refugees. It's ongoing. Recovery in the traditional sense cannot even occur because the trauma has not yet ceased. There's no safe place for many of them. I dare say that refugees do not consider camps in strange countries a safe place. Many of those who have fled violence already had, before the violence, histories of sexual abuse or domestic violence. And we know from the research that this group is more vulnerable to future attacks. If you've been traumatized, you're more vulnerable to being traumatized. Refugees tell stories of sexual assault endured in order to get aid from humanitarian organizations. So the aid worker says, no sex, no food. Finally, many refugees are having a very deep spiritual crisis. Whatever their faith, even if they say they didn't have one, to have your entire world as you knew it lost with no return ever to be likely is to have a faith crisis. We are, whether we like to admit it or not, creatures of the dust. And even the deepest faith in any of us is still rooted to some degree in the material world. We come together with other people in a place to worship. We have rituals. We have certain sounds of faith in our places of worship or in our communities. To experience permanent strangeness means that God, as you have known him in whatever capacity, will also feel strange or absent, or worse yet, evil. Severe trauma and the loss of family members will only exacerbate this. Part of the history of God's people is the lament. And we know that refugees need to be taught and encouraged to lament. It's part of what we do. We understand that. Lament individually and lament corporately. But I also believe that we need to call the global church community to lament with them, weeping with those who weep, even if it's from afar. One of the things that becomes evident here is that the vulnerability of refugees is staggeringly high. They can be easily dismissed, crushed, or scorned. We can make them invisible to ourselves. In many ways, we do that just by turning off the television. Many are doing so, or many see them, but all they see are threatening enemies. Vulnerable people will often become angry and bully others. Vulnerable people may also curl in on themselves, numb, afraid, trying to shut out the world rather than face what has become of them. And the ultimate curling in, of course, is suicide. Vulnerable people also respond to help and love and dignity and respect. That happens to be a principle that pedophiles and traffickers understand thoroughly. Survey who's around you, find the vulnerable, the fragile, the fearful, and the needy, and having found them, move in with seeming goodness in order to manipulate and use. It works for evil. It also works for great good. And if the good is not pursued, we leave them open to those intending evil. And the scriptures are full of the call to look for the vulnerable, to seek them out, the ones who are needy and afraid, the very ones we often don't want in our communities or our places of worship. I believe these are qualities and needs of human beings as God has created us, and that they must inform our care, our thinking, our programs, whatever else we do for refugees. The current crisis has every potential to become a greater one if it breeds chaos, hatred, and violence in this world. Humiliated, bullied, disenfranchised, and hopeless human beings are certainly a danger to themselves. They are also a danger to others. Those are also the human beings that God has specifically called us to seek out and bestow dignity for the sake of his image in them, that they might see him in us.
Okay, now we're back to having a little bit of time here to just walk slowly through this. We've considered the losses and the gains, the unwanted gains of refugees and the impact on them and on us, right? But we're people who want to be helpers. And Diane has just given us a list of foundational truths that must be present in whatever we do, whether it's scripture engagement, trauma healing, or other kinds of humanitarian efforts. They need to be part of it. We need to have as foundational truths things like recognizing eternity, right? And not just the moment in time. The humanity, the embodied humanity of the people that we are trying to help, and that they are spiritual, emotional, relational, people with memory. They have agency and need to have that. There needs to be dignity because they bear the image, no matter what their faith and religion and activities have been in the past. They are need to have continuity with themselves. We see the losses on the individual level, the community level, the national level. Now going forward, we want to think about how are we going to reverse these refugee experiences. And so whatever we do, if we had a lot more time, we could do a lot of brainstorming on this, but whatever we do, Diane is telling us, must reverse these things, but within these principles of honoring the dignity, the agency of the person we're serving. Too often they become one-dimensional, and we have good programmatic plans. And as a result, we are treating objects maybe more like 4 legs than 2. I want to have you just thinking about this further. You know, if we are going to reverse helplessness, are we going to do that with just handouts? No. We need the agency and the activity of those who are serving. Paulo Freire, who was a liberation theologian in South America, talks about the fact that too often we come in with our many words to fill up the ignorant. Well, we could come in with our many Bible verses or our many bags of food, and we would be doing the same kind of harm, because the people that we're serving are people of agency and planning that we need to pay attention to. So one of the ways that we respect these ways is to pay attention to the continuity of the person, the cultural continuity. And Diane highlighted this a little bit, so I want to just point it out a little further. Some of us were passing around this essay recently, and And I took my glasses off, of course, and now I can't read what it says. So let me walk over here. Chandler and Lalonde, cultural continuity as a hedge against suicide in Canada's First Nations. They looked at the problem of suicide in Canada amongst First Nation populations. And they tried to figure out, is there any geographical pattern? Is there a tribal pattern? Is there a language pattern? Is there an economic pattern? And the answer was no, there was none of those patterns. Those did not predict whether a community would have more suicide or fewer suicides. What did predict at this point were those communities that had certain pieces of continuity. They had land. They had health care that they were managing. They had police and fire that they were managing. They had educational systems that they were managing. They had their own government, or at least a portion of it. And they had cultural facilities where they could enact cultural practices. Those communities that had all 6 of these had 0 suicides. 0. Those that had only 1 or 2 had many. So if we are going to reverse the experiences of refugees, we need to be paying attention to immediately providing ways for people to have agency. One of the beauties, again, about healing wounds of trauma that many of you have had experiences is we engage very quickly. What does your culture say about? And what in your community could be a solution to this problem? Because we're getting people already beginning talking, thinking. Now, too often, we look at culture as a problem because we see how culture does not represent the image of Christ. If you remember Reinhold Niebuhr's various characteristics, Christ over culture, Christ against culture, Christ in and through culture, right? We're really good at pointing out Christ against culture. And some of us in the dominant culture think Christ through my culture a little bit too much, right? But part of our job, if we're going to ask these questions about how we are going to engage a population to help them lament and to recover their continuity, their sense of a future self. What hedges against suicide? A sense that there's a future, right? You don't kill yourself if there's a future. So, first off, as we think about this, what can we do? Never underestimate your bearing witness, being present, listening. Too often we want to jump past that to doing something. Well, your listening is doing something. It says that you matter and that there's enough matter there for you to pay attention. When you bear witness, you often emote with them and they see, yes, there is something actually to feel sad about, right? So never underestimate that. Always go back to bearing witness. We see it over and over that this is maybe the most substantial thing you can do. Identify those cultural representations that are present, that talk about trials and suffering and lament. How does this particular culture express that in good ways? Again, if you believe that no matter how distorted this world is, it still reflects the character of God, then you can find it in every culture. No culture is so distorted that it does not already reflect some portion of who Christ is. You can also find not just cultural artifacts to help you or representations with the problems, but also what does resiliency look like? You can utilize their cultural lament practices, and some cultures definitely have more than others, right? We can learn from them. But the lament is not just in words. It can be art. It can be drama. It can be song, theater, symbols. If you can't hear them, you're not listening hard enough. Listen some more. While you're listening and you are engaging and identifying and reflecting back to a population things that are going to be part of the solution, look for the strengths that are in that community. What are the community psychological, sociological, and spiritual supports that already exist there? Notice them, identify them, underline them with a highlighter. Make them known to the population, right? Look for places when you're doing, even if you're just doing scripture-based trauma healing or pastoral care, and we say just because you're not like doing all those things. Don't do it in isolation of the other things that are going on. Entwine them together with the supports that are physical and emotional services that are being provided. We should have no silos. We don't have time and space for that. We need to be entwined and integral. And look for the existing local personnel. You know, it is often that we see people, as we looked as the previous question we asked about refugees who are acting in ways that we'd rather them not to act, right? It can be common then that we overlook those people who are angry and maybe aggressive and maybe rebellious, but those are qualities, in fact, that will give them the power to solve problems. So look for that personnel and empower them, encourage them. Don't wait for them to get as good as you, right? Because you're not that good. Finally, and this is important, the systems of help, the humanitarian systems of help, are always embedded in a culture, and those systems always bring problems. They bring solutions, but they bring problems. When you see those systemic responses that are dangerous and damaging, would you be willing to be a prophet? It's dangerous to be a prophet. Prophets tend to get killed, or at least thrown in wells, right? Taken off to Egypt or other places. Can you stand up and speak up for those practices that encourage helplessness, hopelessness, objectification? Do that. So here's one thing if you're feeling a little bit hopeless. And this ties back to Reverend Williams, your presentation, and Mona, your presentation. This is an image that comes from Brenda Salter McNeil, who is a fantastic preacher. She's out in Seattle now. She was in Chicago for many years. And she's recently published this book. You can see it here, A Roadmap to Reconciliation. So she's talking about racial reconciliation. And she says that we have catalytic events that happen in our lives. And as you know, a catalyst is something that starts fires, starts explosions, starts reactions. You can have a catalyst that leads to isolation, fear, and pulling back. And so there can be things in us that really drive us in that way. But obviously there are also the spiritual catalysts that push us towards reconciliation and understanding and getting into that story and learning and doing something and becoming a prophet. I think the same roadmap works also for working with refugees. And again, if you get a book, you can get copies of this. This is where this image comes from. But there are certain barriers that keep the Spirit from working at times in us. And so I'm actually going to take just 2 minutes of silence here for you to contemplate some barriers that might cause you to go back into a preservation mode. Some of those barriers cause us to move into preservation. We've been out there on the front line serving, working hard, but guilt can actually not be something that's good, but drive us into preservation, right? Hopelessness, fear, and I want to add a fourth one here as well that I just read in my devotions this morning. The desire to be influential. G. Campbell Morgan talks in his commentary on the Acts of the Apostles that says that when we are catalytic, when the Spirit is involved, we will pique the interest of the world. They are going to say, what's up with these guys? Are they drunk? They're going to want to know. We will be influential. But when we desire the idol of influence, and we put up churches, or should I say organizations, that are known to be influential, sometimes we desire that more than being little and fellowshipping with those of our brothers and sisters who have less and not being known. So reflect for 2 minutes. Which of these or any others may be a barrier that God is saying to you, watch out, notice?
Dear Church of Jesus Christ, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. Vindicate the weak and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. You shall not pervert the justice due to an immigrant or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave, and that the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. Do not oppress a stranger. You know the heart of a stranger. You were strangers. Open our mouths. That's what our God calls us to today. We need to open them to the church, who is at least in part confused and fearful, and in some quarters sadly hateful. Teach the church how to lament for others, not just themselves. Open our mouths. We need to open them to government at all levels. They have a complex task and difficult decisions. How many to accept, national security, money, where to put people, everything else. As the people of God, but we can certainly call governments to do this in a humanitarian way so that people are honored as image bearers with respect and kindness. None of what is done, even having to deport somebody, should be done in a dehumanizing way. No single mother and her 3 children should be deported in a terrifying, dehumanizing way at gunpoint, ever. And that happened in this country. And for us, rescue, deliver, bring justice, free from oppression, defend, speak truth, encourage, bring hope. Why? This is something our God says in Leviticus 25. For you are but immigrants and temporary tenants with me. And in Psalm 39, the psalmist says this, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry, for I am an immigrant with you. God says you and I are immigrants with him, aliens in the land, temporary residents, not citizens, here with him. It's a fascinating concept. The very essence of alien or stranger is aloneness, dislocation, disconnection, having no home. Yet our God says, 1, we are immigrants here, and 2, we are temporary tenants with him. And I believe that in order to care for refugees, we need to more clearly see that that is exactly what we are. Peter calls us aliens and strangers, and the meaning of the 2 Greek words there is absolutely fascinating. The literal meaning of the word used for alien is close beside. In other words, someone who lives close to others as a temporary dweller. Sounds like a refugee camp, doesn't it? That's us. We live close beside humanity, but we are temporary dwellers. The second word means someone passing through, this is a stranger, but having relationships. Immigrants with me, he says. So it reflects what we have been saying. Living in a camp, close to others, not at home, and yet life goes on in relationships. Relationships which acknowledge presence and significance. The combination of those two words in Peter captures both the difficulty of not being home, which we often feel ourselves, and yet it underlines the image of God in human beings having relationships. There's dignity in having relationships. And of course, that's a picture of our incarnate Lord. He says not only are we immigrants with him, but he is himself an immigrant with us. He experienced an earthly home. He spent 30 years in one. Worked as a carpenter, had family around him, community. And then he left. He knows what it means to leave. He knows what it's like to have no home and no place to put your head. And he left in part because there was war. There is war and chaos and cruelty in the land. Jesus knew permanent strangeness in his bones. And in leaving that childhood home and basically living as a homeless wanderer, how did he do that? In relationship. He lived with people, he loved them, he spoke truth, and he called them to be immigrants with him. In doing so, he has taught us how to live in this war-torn, disenfranchised, rejected, and labeled world where people are frequently treated as less than image bearers. One of the great principles that I have learned through my 40-plus years with trauma victims is this. Yes, those who are suffering and traumatized need help. And yes, we are called to do that in the same manner as our Lord did. However, those who are suffering and traumatized have a great deal to teach us about ourselves and about our immigrant God, our traumatized God. So as we bring his light to others, God graciously uses them to bring light to us. In light of that, here are a few lessons of today's refugees. One, they deepen our understanding of what it means to be human if we would look. People created in the image of God. That image is an eternal aspect of person, and to treat anyone as if they were not an image bearer is to pierce the heart of our God. Two, the refugees remind us of a truth easily forgotten in this part of the world. We are strangers and aliens. It's a hard way to live, and it's a hard truth we really don't want to remember. We prefer to be anesthetized to it. We want to feel at home, safe. Three, they remind us that we follow a refugee. We worship a refugee. A Lord who left home before he left the one he had here. A glorious home. We can't even comprehend all that he left. And while he was here, he had to flee the sword and the mob and the religious rulers. He understands having to be on the move and having no place to rest. He lived in permanent strangeness. For he tells us, his refugee children, to remember that this is not our home, but to cling fast to the truth that we are immigrants with him. And finally, that refugees, strangers in the land, are called to relationships. Relationships that bring the light and love of God wherever we go. I had to take a flight recently from San Antonio to Dallas, and it was significantly delayed, so I walked up to the gate as it said, "Just departed." I wanted to go to Philadelphia, my home. So I sat around waiting for the later flight, and I was surrounded by others in the same dilemma. And over again, I was thinking about today, and over again I heard people say, "Oh, I just want to go home." You ever been in an airport and said that? Or I would hear somebody say, "I just want to be home and get in my own bed tonight." We all know that feeling. It can be a deep down ache sometimes. And I looked at the people, and I listened to them, and I was observing them and thinking to myself, and for the record, there were a couple of unusual ones. Each one that I see is a man or a woman purposefully knit together by my God. And they all want to go home. That's because as his creatures, we are meant for him, because he is in fact home. Everyone's looking for home. There are many in the world who have utterly lost hope of ever going home. Others are deceived, which is easy to do in some parts of the world, and think they have found their home here. But ultimately, he is our home, and he alone. He is an immigrant with us, and we are immigrants with him. So as we remember and live out this truth, it will give us a basis to respond to the current crisis. If we are rooted to him as our home and as our companion immigrant here, we will speak truth to our culture. We will not be afraid. And we will speak truth to Christendom, who has lost its way in many respects. We will speak truth to Christendom about our immigrant God and his call to care for the least of these. And we will not be hateful to the hateful or demeaning to the demeaning. We will be the voice to God's people, reminding them that they too are immigrants, for many have forgotten. They're called by their God to feed and clothe the needy and welcome the strangers, because that is who he is. And we will pray for the refugee crisis, of course, but we will pray that God will use the least of these to wake us up and to transform us who have forgotten that we are immigrants, and to disturb our sleep. And then we will be convicted, seeking God to be our home more than anything built by human hands. And we will serve through prayer, through truth-telling, through literal work with refugees, here and around the world, training others for the work, through finances, and 1,000 other ways. You see, the mass of refugees in crisis need our help. You don't need me to tell you that. And the church, the living body of Christ, not Christendom, the church, has been put on earth by our immigrant God to serve. However, the living body of our God needs the refugees, because many of us have lost our way, thinking systems and power and money and numbers are the work of our God. They are not. The work of our God is first in the hearts of his people, so that he can make them like himself, so they in turn, like him, can break down barriers and restore ruined lives. He is here. He is in the midst of the chaos and the crisis, and he would have us by heart, by word, and by deed join with him as a fellow immigrant.